So, tectonics is one of the topics you often study in Year 12 for Edexcel Geography A level. And the key things you need to understand for the tectonic unit is that when we talk of tectonics, we talk of three major hazards: earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis. Okay. We also have a look in inquiry question 1 about tectonic plate boundaries, their theories, how they interact, and how they affect areas of different population density. We then, in inquiry question 2, have a look at the link between development, resilience, and the impact of these hazards. Okay, and we focus on the concept of disasters as different to the concept of natural hazards. Natural hazard is an event that puts people at risk. A disaster occurs because people aren't resilient, haven't been given the capabilities to deal with it, and therefore are more vulnerable. Okay, that's the key concept of paper inquiry question 2. Question 3, we have a look at management. What can we do to reduce the risk of disasters and therefore reduce the impact it has on society and economic and social impact? Okay, so inquiry question 1 is as you see it there, we have looked. The first section looks at the distribution of tectonic hazards and the plates, boundaries, and tectonic processes. Okay, so in this case here, we look at different distribution of earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis, where they're located, what areas and what risk, etc. We understand the difference between plate boundaries, and that's where it gets a little bit complicated because in GCSE, often people learn about destructive, conservative, constructive, and collision, and there we change the term slightly. So we talk about divergent, which move away from each other. Conservative stays the same, and a convergent that moves toward each other. Okay, we understand the difference between oceanic and continental crust and how they can combine in different situations. Okay, we also have a look at causes of intraplate earthquakes and volcanoes. So we look at hotspots. Intraplates means earthquakes and volcanoes within a plate itself, so not on the edges of it. We look at the different plate tectonic theories. So these include how the Earth is structured. So you go from crust, mantle, inner core, outer core to crust. We talk about the asthenosphere, lithosphere, upper mantle, lower mantle, inner core, outer core. So slightly different terms again. We look at different theories of convection currents, paleomagnetism, and seafloor spreading or ridge push, which is quite complex. Stress a lot of people. I've done a specific video on that. We look at subduction and slab ball theory, which is probably the one that is most mainstream nowadays. We then have a look at the different types of plate margins and what occurs at each. We look at the concept of Bain-off zone, which looks at the depth of each earthquake and how the different waves affect the strength of the earthquake. We then have a look at the waves, the different primary and secondary impacts of an earthquake. We have a look at the primary secondary impacts of a volcano. We look at we also have a look at the tsunamis. Okay, so ultimately, the kind of case studies you need to know, the case studies we do at Red and Green are for the earthquakes. We look at Tohoku, which is in Japan, and that's a high-income country case study. We then look at Sichuan, which is a region in China, that is a NEE case study, and then we look at the earthquake that took place in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, which is a case study of a low-income country. Okay, volcanoes, we talk about Mauna Loa, which is in Hawaii, because Hawaii is the hotspot we look at in the Pacific Ocean. And then for Iceland, we look at Eyjafjallajökull, which is Jökull means glacier, and we look at the volcano in Iceland that erupted and caused airspace in Europe to have a bit of a meltdown for a few days. We then have a look at the tsunami. Two tsunamis are the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004 in the Indian Ocean, and then the Tohoku tsunami is the same event as the earthquake. The earthquake killed no one, whereas the tsunami had devastating impact and killed about 20,000 people. Same event, but just two different hazards, because tsunamis are secondary impacts of earthquakes. Okay. Inquiry question 2, we then have a look at disasters. We look at definition of natural hazard and disaster. That we understand the concept of vulnerability, resilience, and we look at the hazard risk equation. We have a look at the pressure and release model. We have a look at the social and economic impacts of hazards and how they vary according to different areas. So that's where we look at high income, low income, and newly emerging. We understand how we measure earthquakes and volcanoes. We look at the Mercalli scale, the moment magnitude scale, the Richter scale. We look at the volcanic explosivity index. We also look at the characteristics of earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis, so the speed of onset, magnitude, hazard profiles, basically. We look at the profile of each hazard and how the severity of the social and economic impacts. We have a look at the access to education and how that affects people's vulnerability and resilience. And that's where we really tackle a concept called governance. Good governance. How does a good government reduce the risk of a disaster? There's a big link between good governance and lack of disasters. There we have a look at the different types of governance: local, national, regional, national, supranational, like the EU, for instance. And then we look at contrasting events. Okay, there again, case studies are exactly the same. The difference is you need to understand what the hazard profile is, how to read one, how to potentially build one. You need to understand the pressure and release model. Okay, so what causes vulnerability? What are the root causes of vulnerability? Okay, so kind of if you divide inquiry question 2 into 3, first section is about the link between vulnerability, resilience, and the hazards. The second section is about contrasting that between case studies, and the third section is about governance and how that affects different countries. And the final inquiry question is inquiry question 3. There we start to look at management. So the first section here looks at the trends and patterns of disasters, and look at the impact. So we have a look at how do you measure the trends? What are the trends? We have a look at mega disasters, disasters that have a global impact. We have a look at multiple hazard zones, focusing on the Philippines, areas that are battered by hydrometeorological hazards as well as tectonic. So the Philippines get tropical storms, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis. They get everything, and the impact it has on the development. We have a look at understanding the ability to predict and manage hazards. So we look at the role of scientists, the role of emergency planners. We have a look at the park model. We also have a look at ways in which you can mitigate, which is to reduce the causes in the first place, and adapt, which is to deal with the consequences. Okay, so how can we mitigate? We look at the role of planners and engineers. We look at how we can use models to reduce the impacts in the future. We look at the role of NGOs and insurers. We have a look at modifying basically the event itself, which is mitigating. We look at modifying the vulnerability, which is about building resilience, and we look at modifying the loss, which is damage limitation, basically. And kind of often that is a 20 marker, and modifying the event is better than modifying the vulnerability. That is better than modifying the loss. Okay, and examples of diverting the lava flows, that you're modifying the event. Your monitoring and prediction is modifying vulnerability, and modifying the loss is just insurance. It's about emergency search and rescue, etc. Okay. And in this case here, again, same case studies, except we add Philippines for multiple hazard zone, and we also look at the park model too. Okay, the final bit is geographical skills. The exam board expects you, not exclusively, but expect you to be able to analyze hazard distribution patterns and on scales on a map in your exam. It'll expect you to be able to identify using a diagram different plate margins, analyze tsunami time travel based on map skills. It'll assume you'll be able to correlate techniques to analyze the link between magnitude, death, and damage. It'll assume you can do some statistics of mode, median, mean, interquartile range, potential spearman's rank for death and damage. It'll expect you to be able to assess the reliability of the data and interpret complex data. And GIS is basically use maps and criteria on a map, like Google Map, to be able to assess the degree of risk. Okay, but in exams, very little of that, to be fair. Okay, but these are some of the skills that I expect you to do. Basically, numeracy skills through statistics, and map skills and analytical skills through graphs and maps is what you need to be able to do. Okay.